She was about to lose everything. The wind in Las Sombras didn't just carry dust, it carried whispers of failure, and every single one of them had Annie Morales' name on it. Her ranch, the only thing her husband had left her, besides a heartbroken little girl, was bleeding out. The earth was cracked, the well was low, and the bank was circling like a vulture. And the head vulture had a name, Run Traz. He sat behind his big oak desk, smelling of expensive cigars and cheap cruelty. He wasn't just a banker. He was the king of this dusty little kingdom, and he knew it. His eyes slid over Annie, not seeing a woman, but a problem he could profit from. 3 notes past due, Mrs. Morales, he said, his voice smooth as snake oil. And your last payment was insufficient. Annie's hands were clenched so tight her knuckles were white. The wheat harvest is 2 weeks away. You'll have your money. He leaned forward, a predator sensing the final moments of the hunt. I'm trying to be a friend here, Annie. A woman can't run a ranch alone. It's not proper. The books need a man's name on them. A husband. The word hung in the air, heavy and insulting. He wasn't offering advice. He was delivering an ultimatum. 30 days, he said, leaning back with a smug grin. Find a husband or find a new home. He thought he had her. He thought she'd break, that she'd cry, that she'd beg. But Annie Morales didn't break. She turned and walked out of that bank with her head held high, the desert wind whipping at her worn dress. She had 30 days to find a miracle. And in a town like Las Sombras, miracles were in shorter supply than water. But what she didn't know was that her miracle was already in town, leaning against a post at the far end of the market, watching the world with eyes that saw far too much. The market was a swirl of noise and desperation, but Annie moved through it like a ghost. Her daughter Luna held her hand, clutching a rag doll with mismatched button eyes. Annie's mind was racing, trying to weave a plan out of thin air. How do you find a husband in a town where every man either worked for Runtras or feared him? Then she saw it, a scuffle. 2 grimy drifters were trying to bully an old cart vendor, Senor Delgado, grabbing at his meager pile of vegetables. People watched, but nobody moved. Fear was a currency in Las Sombras, and Runtras had everyone paid in full. Except one man. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace. He wasn't big, but he moved like every inch of him was coiled steel. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stepped between the old man and the thugs, said something too low for Annie to hear, and in a blur of motion, one of the drifters was on his back, gasping for air, and the other was backing away with his hands up. The cowboy picked up the scattered vegetables, handed them back to the stunned vendor, tipped his hat, and walked away as if he'd just been asking for the time. The crowd dispersed, murmuring. Annie just stood there, her heart pounding. It wasn't just the display of strength. It was the quiet dignity, the way he'd defended someone who couldn't defend himself. She found him by the town well, filling a canteen. The sun beat down on his worn hat, and his sleeves were rolled up, showing forearms corded with muscle. He looked like he'd been carved from the tough, unyielding landscape itself. You're not from around here, she said. It wasn't a question. He looked up, and for the first time, she saw his eyes. They were a startling blue, a shade you'd expect to see in the sky after a long rain. He gave a slow, easy smile. Is it that obvious, ma'am? You helped Senor Delgado, she said, ignoring his question. No one helps him. He shrugged, screwing the cap on his canteen. Seemed like the right thing to do. Annie took a breath. She was a woman who built fences, not gambled. But Runtras had pushed her to the edge of the cliff. There was nothing left to do but jump. What's your name? J.J. McCall. Are you married, Mr. McCall? He paused, a flicker of surprise in those blue eyes. He looked her up and down, but not in the way other men did. He wasn't measuring her worth. He was reading her story. No, ma'am, I'm not. Here it was. The leap. Would you pretend to be? The silence that followed was so complete, Annie could hear the beat of her own heart. He lowered his canteen, his smile gone, his gaze sharp and serious. He looked at her, then at little Luna hiding behind her skirt and back again. He saw the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. Beg pardon? He finally said. It's a business arrangement, she said quickly, her voice betraying a tremor she hated. "I need to convince a banker I'm not alone. Just for a few weeks. I can pay. Not much, but the ranch has room and board." He didn't laugh. He didn't look at her like she was crazy. He just stood there thinking. He looked up at the unforgiving sun, then back at her. "You don't know a thing about me," he said, his voice low. "I could be a thief, a murderer. I don't have time to learn your history, Mr. McCall," she replied, her own voice finding its steel again. "I only have time to make a choice. And I saw you choose to help an old man when no one else would. That's enough for me." Another long silence. The fate of her home, her daughter's future, it all hung on the word of this stranger. Finally, he gave a slow nod, a ghost of a grin touching his lips. "I'm not much of an actor, Mrs. Morales." "Annie," she corrected him, her breath catching in her throat. He tipped his hat. "Well, Annie, I might not be an actor, but I've always been good at picking a side in a fight. And from where I'm standing, you look to be on the right one." He slung the canteen over his shoulder. "I reckon I can play the part of a decent husband." Relief washed over Annie so powerfully her knees felt weak. "Welcome to the Morales Ranch, Mr. McCall." As they walked away from the well, neither of them noticed Run Traz watching from the window of his office. His eyes narrowed into slits. He'd seen the whole exchange, and he was already making a plan to burn their little arrangement to the ground. J.J. McCall arrived at the Morales Ranch with nothing but a bedroll and a single saddlebag. There was no ceremony, no grand entrance. He just appeared at the kitchen door as the sun was setting, a silent figure against the vast, lonely landscape. Annie showed him to a small room off the back, the one that used to be her husband's study. It was little more than a cot and a small window, but he just nodded and set his things down. The pretense began immediately, but it felt strange. The first morning, Annie woke before dawn, a habit born of worry. She stepped onto the porch with a cup of weak coffee, expecting to find the silence she knew so well. Instead, she heard the rhythmic creak of the well pump. Jay was already there, his shirt already dark with sweat, hauling water as if he'd been doing it his whole life. He didn't ask what needed doing. He just saw what was broken and fixed it. A loose fence post, a cracked water trough, a stubborn hinge on the barn door. He moved with a quiet competence that was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. He was supposed to be an actor playing a part, but his hands looked like they knew their way around hard work. They were calloused and capable, not the hands of a simple drifter. And then there was Luna. Her daughter, who had been quiet and withdrawn since her father's passing, started to bloom under Jay's attention. He didn't coddle her. He treated her with a gentle respect. He taught her how to whittle a small bird from a piece of scrap wood, his large hands guiding her small ones with impossible patience. He'd crouch down to her level when he spoke to her, his blue eyes serious as he listened to her stories about her button-eyed doll. Annie watched it all from a distance, a knot of confusion tightening in her chest. This was a deal, a lie to save her land. So why did it feel less like a performance and more like a home? The neighbors started whispering. Of course. Ezra Bell, the blacksmith, grunted his approval. "That fella Morales took in, he's got good hands. Set a shoe on my mare faster than I could." Old Mrs. Foster, whose property bordered theirs, called over the fence, "He's a handsome one, Annie, and polite, too. Tipped his hat to me yesterday." Annie would just smile and nod, playing her part. But the questions were piling up inside her. One evening, long after Luna was asleep, a storm rolled in. Thunder rattled the small house. Annie was checking the windows when she passed Jay's room. The door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. She paused, listening. She heard a strange, soft sound, a gentle scratching. Curiosity got the better of her. She peered through the crack. Jay was sitting on the floor, his back to her, hunched over something in his lap. An oil lamp cast a warm glow around him. He wasn't cleaning a gun or mending his clothes. He was fixing Luna's rag doll. The button eye had come loose. With a fine needle and thread he'd pulled from his saddlebag, he was carefully, methodically stitching it back on. His fingers, which could tame a horse and split firewood, moved with the delicate precision of a surgeon. Annie's breath caught in her chest. It was such a small thing, a meaningless thing. But no one had shown that kind of gentle care for her daughter, for her world in so long. She backed away silently, her heart a wild, chaotic drum against her ribs. This wasn't part of the deal. Fixing a child's toy in the middle of the night wasn't in the contract. She returned a few minutes later with a mug of hot milk and honey and set it just outside his door. She didn't knock. She didn't say a word. The next morning, the mug was sitting by the sink, washed and dried. He never mentioned it. Neither did she. But something had shifted. The line between the lie and the truth had begun to blur. And that scared Annie more than any threat Run Traz could ever make. Because the lie was safe. The truth felt dangerously real. The first real test came a week later. The annual grain auction was the lifeblood of Las Sombras, and this year it felt more like a public execution. The drought had hit everyone hard. Prices were going to be rock bottom. For Annie, a bad price wasn't just a loss. It was the final nail in her coffin. She stood by her wagon, her wheat looking thin and pale, her stomach in knots. But she wasn't alone. Jay stood beside her, his presence a silent wall of support. He didn't say much, just nodded to the other ranchers, his hand resting casually on his hip, near the worn leather of his gun belt. His stance said more than words ever could. It said, she is not unprotected. When Annie's lot came up for bid, a hush fell over the crowd. Men exchanged knowing glances. They all knew her situation. They knew Run Traz had his boot on her neck. Ezra Bell, the blacksmith, cleared his throat. I'll offer 2 cents less per bushel than last year's price. It was a lowball offer, an insult disguised as a business deal. That's not a fair price, Ezra, and you know it, Annie said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Drought came, Annie. Ezra shrugged, avoiding her eyes. Risk's gone up. Can't be helped. Before she could argue, Jay stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmuring crowd like a razor. Then I suppose you're lowering the price for everyone, Mr. Bell, he said, his blue eyes locking onto the blacksmith. Or is it just the widows who have to bear the risk of a dry season? The crowd went dead silent. No one talked to Ezra Bell like that. More importantly, no one questioned the unspoken rules of this town, where the weak were picked clean. Then a new voice slithered through the silence. Seems you've found yourself a mouthpiece, Mrs. Morales. Run Traz emerged from the crowd, a smug smile plastered on his face. He moved like he owned the very ground they stood on. He stopped in front of them, his eyes glinting with malice. Does he read your contracts for you too? Annie felt a surge of rage, but Jay was faster. I read just fine, Jay said, his voice calm and even. He took a step closer to Traz, a subtle shift that put him directly between the banker and Annie. And I punch a hell of a lot better. Traz's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by some nameless drifter. He recovered quickly, his eyes narrowing as he sized Jay up. I know every man worth knowing in this territory, mister, Traz sneered. And I've never seen you before. Where did you say you were from? I didn't, Jay replied with a lazy grin. But it's nowhere you'd be welcome. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. A few of the ranchers were trying to hide their own smiles. They might fear Traz, but they loved seeing him put in his place. Traz looked from Jay's confident stance to Annie's defiant expression, and he knew he was losing control of the situation. But he had one more card to play. Funny, Traz said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I have a nose for people, for their history. And you, Mr. McCall, is it? You don't have one. He paused for effect. It's almost as if you don't exist at all. The words were a direct threat, a promise of what was to come. They sold the wheat that day, not for a great price, but a fair one. Jay's stand had shamed the other bidders into decency. As they walked home, Luna skipping between them, Annie felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. But she couldn't shake Traz's final words. It's almost as if you don't exist at all. She glanced at the man walking beside her, the man who had defended her, who had fixed her daughter's doll, who felt more like a partner than any man she'd ever known. And she realized with a chilling certainty that Run Traz was right. She knew absolutely nothing about him, and that secret was a loaded gun pointed straight at her heart. Run Traz was a man who hated surprises, and J.J. McCall was the biggest surprise to hit Las Sombras in a decade. So the day after the auction, Traz sent a writer to the territorial capital in Santa Fe. A simple request: find everything you can on a man named J.J. McCall. 2 days later, the response came back. It was a single sheet of paper. Run read it, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. No birth record. No land deeds. No marriage licenses. No military service. No criminal record. In the eyes of the New Mexico Territory, J.J. McCall was a ghost, and Traz knew just how to use a ghost to haunt a widow. He waited for the perfect moment, the monthly town meeting. The whole of Las Sombras was packed into the small church hall, the air thick with the smell of kerosene and simmering resentment over water rights. Annie and Jay sat in a pew near the back, Luna asleep on Jay's lap. They looked for all the world like a family. Traz stood up at the front, his posture radiating false benevolence. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice dripping with concern. "We are here to talk about our community, about the trust that binds us together, the very foundation of Las Sombras." He let the words sink in, scanning the faces in the room. "And trust," he continued, his eyes landing on Annie, "requires that we know who stands among us. We must know who we are dealing with, who we are welcoming into our homes and into our beds." A collective gasp went through the room. Annie's spine went rigid. She knew what was coming. Traz held up the letter from Santa Fe. "Our good Mrs. Morales here has taken on a new husband." He spat the word out like it was poison. "A man who stood up for her at the auction, a man who works her land. But I have to ask myself, who is this man?" He looked directly at Jay. "I took the liberty of checking the territorial records. I looked for a J.J. McCall. And you know what I found?" He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was suffocating. "Nothing." The word exploded in the quiet hall. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Eyes turned on Annie and Jay, filled with suspicion and accusation. "There is no record of this man. Anywhere," Traz boomed, his voice filled with righteous indignation. "He has no past, no family, no history. The man you have brought into your home, Annie, the man you have sleeping under your roof, next to your innocent child, he does not exist." The accusation hung in the air, thick and damning. Annie felt the world tilting under her. She looked at Jay, expecting to see panic, or anger, or shame, but he showed none of it. His expression was calm, almost serene. He gently handed the sleeping Luna to Annie, stood up, and began to walk down the center aisle. Every eye was on him. The scrape of his boots on the wooden floor was the only sound. He didn't stop until he was standing at the front of the church, face to face with Run Traz. He didn't look at Traz. He looked out at the faces of the townspeople, their neighbors. "He's right," Jay said, his voice clear and steady, reaching every corner of the room. "On paper, I don't exist." He let that admission settle. Then he continued. "My name isn't written in a ledger in Santa Fe. You won't find it on a deed or a title, because my story isn't written in ink. It's written in sweat. It's written in the calluses on my hands from mending a fence that wasn't mine. It's written in the wood I chopped to keep a family warm." He turned his head slightly, his gaze finding Annie in the back pew. "My reality isn't in a government file. It's in the smile of a little girl who learned how to whistle for the first time yesterday. It's in the hope in the eyes of a woman who refuses to be broken. That's where I exist. I exist where it matters." He turned back to the crowd, his voice dropping but losing none of its power. "You all know Annie. You know her strength. You know her heart. And you know she deserves to have someone standing by her side. If you want to judge me by a piece of paper, that's your right. But if you want to know who I really am, don't look in a filing cabinet." He took a step towards them. "Look at the fields I've helped plow. Look at the roof I've helped patch. Look at the family I've chosen to defend. That's my history. That's my truth." No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. He had taken Runtraz's weapon and turned it back on him, exposing it for what it was, a hollow, meaningless piece of paper. He had redefined what it meant to be real. Even Runtraz was speechless, the letter from Santa Fe suddenly looking flimsy and pathetic in his hand. As people began to file out of the church, something had changed. A rancher clapped Jay on the shoulder. Ezra Bell gave him a gruff nod of respect. Mrs. Foster patted Annie's arm and whispered, "You've got a good one there, dear." Walking home under the blanket of stars, Annie gave Jay a smile that was so real, so full of gratitude, and something more, something deeper that it lit up the darkness. But as they approached the quiet ranch house, a new, colder fear crept into Annie's heart. His speech had been beautiful, inspiring, a masterpiece of deflection, and it hadn't answered a single damn question. Who was this man who could silence a room with nothing but his words? A simple drifter? A man with no history? Not a chance. His speech proved the opposite. A man with no past couldn't speak with that much power. Jay McCall wasn't a ghost. He was a man with a past so big, he'd had to bury it in the desert. And Annie knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that sooner or later, the dead have a way of rising. The town hall meeting changed things on the surface. The whispers about Jay turned from suspicion to respect. Runtraz retreated into his bank, his public humiliation making him more reclusive, and Annie suspected, more dangerous. But inside the small ranch house, the questions only grew louder. Annie started noticing things, small details that didn't fit the picture of a simple cowboy. One afternoon, she was struggling to draft a letter to a seed supplier in Santa Fe, trying to negotiate a better price for the spring planting. Jay came in from the barn, saw her frustration, and gently took the pen from her hand. "Mind if I try?" he asked. She watched, stunned, as he wrote. His penmanship was flawless, a clean, elegant script she'd expect from a lawyer or a scholar. The language he used was precise, persuasive, and legally sound. It wasn't the letter of a ranch hand. It was the letter of a man who understood contracts and commerce on a level she couldn't fathom. He hadn't just learned to read, he had been educated. A few days later, a dispute erupted with a neighboring rancher over a section of their shared fence line. The man was belligerent, claiming a creek bed gave him rights to an extra 10 feet of her pasture. The argument got heated. Just as voices were being raised, Jay walked over, calm as ever. He listened to the neighbor's tirade, then quoted verbatim a specific clause from the Territorial Land Tenure Act of 1869 that proved the man was wrong. He then explained the legal precedent behind it in simple, clear terms. The neighbor stared at him, mouth agape, then stomped off, muttering about damned city lawyers in cowboy boots. Annie just stood there, her mind reeling. Where did a drifter learn territorial law? The final piece of the puzzle fell into place one evening, while they were canning peaches for the winter. To fill the silence, Annie idly asked if he'd ever traveled much, if he'd ever seen the lavender fields near the California border. Jay smiled, a distant look in his eyes. "They remind me of Provence," he said softly. Then, in flawless, unaccented French, he added, "Là, où le ciel et la terre se teignent de violet." There, where the sky and the earth stain themselves purple. Annie froze, a peach slipping from her fingers into the boiling pot. French. He spoke perfect, lyrical French. She said nothing. She finished canning the peaches, put Luna to bed, and sat on the porch for hours, staring out at the impenetrable darkness of the desert. The man sleeping in her husband's old room wasn't who he said he was. The cowboy, the drifter, the ranch hand, it was all a costume, an incredibly convincing one, but a costume nonetheless. The next morning, she waited for him by the barn. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. As he approached pitchfork in hand, she stood in his path, her arms crossed, her eyes hard. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice low and tight. He stopped, his blue eyes meeting hers. He didn't feign ignorance. He just watched her, a strange sadness in his expression. "I told you, my name is Jay McCall." "No," she shot back. "That's the name you use. That's the label on the bottle. I want to know what's inside. I saw you write a letter a lawyer would be proud of. I heard you quote land laws like you wrote them. And last night, you spoke French like you were born in Paris. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Who are you?" He slowly leaned the pitchfork against the barn wall. He wiped his hands on a rag, taking his time, as if gathering his thoughts. Finally, he looked at her, his gaze direct and unblinking. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm not just a cowboy." He waited, giving her the space to react, but he didn't offer any more. "Then what are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice cracking with a week's worth of pent-up fear and confusion. "Why all the lies? Why this game? What kind of man walks into a widow's life, wins over her child, defends her home, and it's all just a part he's playing?" He took a slow breath, the sound loud in the morning quiet. "Because the life I left behind, that was the game, Annie. This," he gestured to the dusty ranch, the endless sky. "This is the only thing that's ever felt real." He stepped closer, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it. "I came from a world where your last name is more important than your character, where people measure your worth by the money in your bank account, not the strength in your heart. I had a name that could open any door, and all I ever wanted to do was run away." He looked down at his calloused hands. "So I did. I left it all behind. I wanted to see if the man was worth anything without the name. I came to Las Sombras hoping to find a place where nobody cared who I was, only what I could do." He looked up, and his eyes were filled with a raw, aching vulnerability that stole her breath. "I didn't lie to you to trick you, Annie. I lied because I was hoping I could trick myself into believing it was true." The silence between them was a living thing. The truth was there, hanging in the air, incomplete but undeniable. He wasn't a drifter. He was a runaway, a prince who had traded his castle for a dusty barn. He turned to pick up the pitchfork again. Before he walked into the cool darkness of the barn, he looked back at her one last time. "When I mended Luna's doll," he said softly, "when I held her hand, when I stood up for you at that auction, none of that was an act, Annie. That was me, the real me." He disappeared into the shadows, leaving Annie standing alone in the bright morning sun, more confused than ever. She knew part of the truth now, but she also knew, with a dreadful sense of foreboding, that a man who runs that hard, from that much, is always running from more than just a name. He's running from a reckoning, and it was only a matter of time before it found him. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon of their lives finally broke on a cold, starless night. The air was heavy, charged with unspoken truths in the coming winter. Inside the ranch house, a fire crackled in the hearth, a small pocket of warmth against the encroaching dark. Luna was asleep by the fire, her chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of childhood dreams. Annie was cleaning the kitchen, her movements slow and deliberate, her mind miles away, trying to piece together the puzzle of the man in her house. Jay had gone out to the barn to check on the horses, a nightly ritual he never missed. A small thud from the back room startled her. She turned to see Luna, no longer by the fire, crouched beside the small, simple wooden chest Jay kept under his cot. The lid was open. "Luna, honey, no," Annie whispered, rushing over. "We don't go through other people's things." "I was looking for the wooden bird," Luna said, her voice small and sleepy. "He said it was in his box." But Annie wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on what lay on top of the jumble of contents inside the chest. It was a linen handkerchief, impeccably clean, made of a fabric so fine it seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. In the corner, embroidered in elegant gold thread, were two words that made the blood drain from her face: McCall Mining Co. It wasn't just a name, it was an empire. The McCall dynasty was a legend in the territory, a family whose wealth in silver and land was second only to the government itself. They were ruthless, powerful, and lived in a world of politics and privilege that was a universe away from this dusty ranch. Her hand trembled as she reached into the chest. Beneath the handkerchief were ledgers bound in fine leather, property deeds for vast tracts of land, and a formal photograph. In it, a much younger Jay stood stiffly in a tailored suit beside a severe-looking older man. Behind them stood a mansion so grand it looked like a palace. This wasn't the chest of a man running from a comfortable life. This was the chest of a man who had abdicated a throne. The back door creaked open, and Jay stepped inside, brushing dust from his shoulders. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes going from the open chest to the handkerchief in Annie's hand, to the look of stunned betrayal on her face. The silence was deafening. "So this is who you are," she said. her voice barely a whisper. She held up the handkerchief. McCall Mining. He didn't deny it. He just nodded slowly, his face a mask of weary resignation. The second son, he said. The one they called the poet. The one who was supposed to marry a senator's daughter and double the family's influence in Washington. Why? She asked, the single word encompassing 1,000 questions. Why here? Why her? Why the charade? He walked over and slowly knelt beside her on the floor. Because I was suffocating, Annie. My entire life was planned out for me. From the schools I attended to the woman I was expected to marry. I met her twice. She told me she found horses to be odorous. I knew right then I couldn't do it. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. I left everything behind except that chest. I had to know if I could build something with my own two hands. Something real. Something that mattered. Before she could respond, there was a sharp, authoritative knock at the front door. It wasn't the knock of a neighbor. It was the knock of someone who expected to be obeyed. Jay's body went tense. He stood up slowly and opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man who seemed to be the physical embodiment of the world Jay had run from. He was tall, dressed in an expensive wool coat, and his polished boots looked like they had never touched dirt. His face was a colder, harder version of Jay's. "Hello, little brother," the man said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. He stepped inside without being invited, his eyes sweeping over the humble room with disdain. He looked at Annie, then at the open chest on the floor. "Well, well, it seems the cat is out of the bag. I trust you've been entertaining my runaway sibling." "William," Jay said, his voice tight with anger. "What are you doing here?" "Father sent me," William sneered. "He's tired of your little rustic fantasy. He wants you to come home, assume your duties, and stop embarrassing the family name by playing house with this." He waved a dismissive hand in Annie's direction. Annie stood up, her eyes flashing with fire. "You are not welcome in my home." William ignored her completely, his focus entirely on Jay. "The choice is simple. You return with me tonight, and your indiscretion will be forgiven. You will be restored to your position. Or you stay here, and you will be officially disowned. Cut off. No inheritance. No position on the board. Not a single dollar. You will be exactly what you've been pretending to be. A nobody." Jay looked from his brother's cruel, calculating face to Annie's. He saw the fire in her eyes, the protective way she stood in front of her sleeping daughter. He saw the home he had found, the peace he had discovered. He turned back to William, and for the first time since his brother arrived, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. "Then cut me off," Jay said, his voice ringing with a newfound freedom. "Maybe then I'll finally be free of you all." William's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. The polite facade vanished, replaced by something cold and venomous. "You think this is a game? You think you can just walk away? You have no idea what you're doing." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. "You're not just running away from your inheritance, Jay. Don't forget what else you're running from. Don't forget what I know, what I can prove." Jay's smile vanished. A flicker of something that looked like fear, real fear, flashed in his eyes. "This fantasy of yours ends tonight," William said, a triumphant smirk returning to his face. "One way or another." He looked at Annie, then at Jay, his eyes glinting with a dark promise. "You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it." And with that, he turned and was gone, leaving a chilling silence in his wake. Annie stared at Jay. William's last words echoed in the small room. "Don't forget what else you're running from." It wasn't just a name. It wasn't just an inheritance. There was another secret, a darker one, and it was coming for them. The days after William's visit were thick with a tension that was worse than any open conflict. Jay became a ghost in the house he'd helped to build. He worked from before sunup to long after sundown, throwing himself into his chores with a desperate, frantic energy. He split firewood as if he were trying to shatter the past, his axe falling with a force that seemed to shake the very ground. Annie watched him from the kitchen window, her heart a tangled mess of fear, sympathy, and suspicion. William's threat hung between them, unspoken but ever present. What else are you running from? She wanted to ask. She needed to know. But she saw the haunted look in Jay's eyes and couldn't bring herself to push. She knew that whatever the secret was, it was tearing him apart. He had made his choice, standing up to his family for her, for this life. But the cost of that choice was a debt that was clearly coming due. The 30 days run Traz had given her were almost up. The final loan payment, the one she had no way of making, was due in the morning. The lie they had constructed was about to crumble, and the reality was going to be brutal. That night, the air in the kitchen was heavy and sad. Luna was asleep, blissfully unaware. Annie sat at the small wooden table across from Jay. The oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Between them, on the worn surface of the table, she placed the simple, thin gold band they had bought at the mercantile to serve as her wedding ring, the prop for their charade. It glinted in the lamplight like a final, silent tear. "The script is over, Jay," she said, her voice soft but impossibly final. "You don't owe me anything more. You've done more than I ever could have asked." He stared at the ring but didn't move. "I won't be the reason you lose everything," she continued, her own voice thick with emotion she refused to let fall. "I won't be the anchor that drags you down into whatever storm your brother's bringing. You need to go. You need to face them, fix whatever this is. Don't lose your entire world for a woman with nothing but debts and a patch of dry land." He finally looked up, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it was like a physical blow. "You think this was about the land for me, Annie? You think any of this was pretend?" She didn't answer. She couldn't, because a part of her was terrified that it was. That night, he didn't sleep in the house. He took his bedroll to the barn. Annie lay awake for hours, listening to the lonely cry of the wind, feeling the emptiness of the room next door like a physical wound. She had set him free, and it was the hardest thing she had ever done. The next morning rose cold and gray. True to his word, Run Traz arrived just after sunrise. He wasn't alone. He had two of his clerks with him, and he carried a leather satchel filled with legal documents. He swaggered onto the porch as if he already owned it, a triumphant smirk on his face. A small group of curious townspeople gathered at the gate, vultures drawn to the scent of a fresh kill. Annie stood on the porch to meet him, her back straight, her face pale but resolute. Luna clung to her skirt, her small face filled with fear. In Annie's hand was the deed transfer document Traz had sent her, the paper that would sign away her home, her past, and her future. "Ready to be reasonable, Mrs. Morales?" Traz said, his voice oozing false sympathy. "Let's not make this any harder than it has to be." "This ranch is not for sale," Annie said, her voice shaking but clear. Traz chuckled. "You have no money, no collateral. And," he said, looking around the empty yard with dramatic flair, "it seems you have no husband. Where is your brave protector this morning? Did he finally run out of pretty words?" It was over. She had lost. She looked at the faces at the gate, at Traz's smug grin, at the tears welling in her daughter's eyes. She had failed. "On the contrary," a voice cut through the morning air, sharp and clear as a ringing bell. "He was just attending to some business." Every head turned. Walking up the path from the main road was Jay. But it wasn't the Jay they knew. Gone were the dusty jeans and worn flannel shirt. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, a crisp white shirt, and polished boots that shone even in the dim morning light. He moved with an air of authority and power that was utterly commanding. He looked like the man in the photograph. He looked like a McCall. Run Traz's jaw dropped. Jay walked right up to the porch, stopping beside Annie. He gave her a small, reassuring smile before turning his ice-cold gaze on the banker. "I am Jay McCall," he said, his voice resonating with power, "of the McCall Mining Corporation, legal heir and primary stakeholder." A wave of gasps and murmurs went through the crowd at the gate. "And I am also," he continued, his voice rising, "the legal and permanent husband of Mrs. Annie Morales." Annie's own gasp was the loudest of all. Her hand flew to her mouth as she stared at him. "This is absurd," Traz sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "A trick. There's no record." "There is now," Jay said calmly. From the inner pocket of his coat, he produced a document with an official-looking seal. "This is a marriage license, filed and witnessed by the circuit judge in El Viento 2 days ago. It is legally binding. He then produced another sheaf of papers. And this is a bank draft drawn from my personal accounts in Santa Fe for the full and complete balance of the loan on this property, plus interest. You will find it is quite sufficient. He handed the papers to one of Trass's stunned clerks, who looked at them as if they were written in a foreign language. The numbers on the draft were astronomical. Run Trass stood there, sputtering, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been outmaneuvered, outplayed, and utterly humiliated. The crowd at the gate, sensing the shift in power, began to cheer. Mrs. Foster was clapping her hands with glee. Even Ezra Bell cracked a wide, toothy grin. Amid the chaos, Jay turned to Annie, his expression softening. He saw the tears streaming down her face, the look of utter shock and hope in her eyes. I know this wasn't how you wanted to win your freedom, he said, his voice for her alone. But it's yours, Annie. It was always yours. You earned it with your blood and your sweat. I just signed the papers. She stared at him, the stranger in fine clothes who smelled of expensive wool and the faint, familiar scent of hay and firewood. The runaway prince who had fixed her fences and her daughter's doll. The man who had just saved her world. Then in front of Run Traz, in front of the whole town, she did the only thing that made any sense. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of gratitude. It wasn't for the crowd. It was a kiss that poured out every ounce of fear, hope, and love she had been holding inside for weeks. It was an anchor finding its harbor in the middle of a hurricane. When they finally broke apart, breathless, he leaned his forehead against hers. So, he whispered, a grin spreading across his face, is this the part where we stop pretending? She laughed through her tears, a beautiful, broken sound. It stopped being pretend, she whispered back, the night you stayed for supper. What she didn't know was that their problems were far from over, because a marriage certificate was one thing. But William McCall was still out there, holding a secret that could destroy not just Jay's reputation, but their entire future. The battle for the ranch was won. The war for their life together was just beginning. The town of Las Sombras celebrated the downfall of Run Traz for a week. The story of the mysterious cowboy who turned out to be a silver heir and saved the widow's ranch became an instant legend. The cheers and backpats followed Jay and Annie wherever they went. But inside the walls of the ranch house, a fragile, awkward silence had descended. They had kissed in front of everyone. He had declared himself her husband. But at night, he still slept on the cot in the barn, and she still slept in the house with Luna. The legal documents said they were married, but the space between them felt wider than ever. The lie had become a legal truth, but the emotional truth was still lost somewhere in the middle, and the shadow of William's threat still lingered. What else are you running from? One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, Annie found Jay on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood, his face lost in thought. She came out with 2 mugs of coffee and sat beside him, the way they had so many times before. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just watched the colors fade from the sky. Finally, Jay broke the silence, his voice quiet and rough. My brother, William, he's always been jealous. As the second son, I had more freedom. I was the one our father confided in. William got the title, but I got the trust. He paused, his knife stilling in his hand. About a year ago, a large sum of money went missing from one of the company's transport accounts. It was a sophisticated theft, done through the ledgers. Only a handful of people had the access to do it. I was one of them. Annie's heart went cold. She said nothing, just listened. William found evidence, Jay continued, his voice laced with bitterness. Evidence that pointed directly to me. Forged signatures that looked like mine. A witness who claimed he saw me meeting with a known swindler. It was a perfect frame-up. He presented it to our father. He didn't accuse me publicly. That would cause a scandal. Instead, he used it as leverage. He told me to accept the arranged marriage and fall in line, or he would ruin me. He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a pain that was years in the making. So I ran. It was cowardly. I should have stayed and fought him, But I was so tired of that world, of their games. I just wanted out. That was the secret, Annie. That's what he was holding over me. He made me a fugitive. Annie processed this, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The educated speech, the knowledge of contracts, it all made sense. He wasn't just a poet, he was a businessman, and his own brother had tried to destroy him. When he came here, Jay said, when he threatened me, I knew I couldn't run anymore. This place, you, Luna, you were worth fighting for. So the 2 days I was gone, I wasn't just filing a marriage license. I went to Santa Fe and hired the best private investigator in the territory. A man my father used to retain. I gave him everything I knew, and I paid him to find the truth, no matter the cost. He took a shaky breath. This morning, I got a telegram. They found it. They found the real money trail. It didn't lead to me. It led to a series of bad investments William made in secret. He used the company's money to cover his own debts and frame me to hide his failure. The witness was paid to lie. It's all there. Proof. He had cleared his name. He had faced the demon he'd been running from. Annie finally spoke, her voice soft. Why didn't you tell me? Shame, he admitted, looking down at his hands. I came here to be someone new, someone better. But I was still carrying all the baggage of the old life. I didn't want you to see me as a coward or a thief. I wanted to be the man you thought I was. Just a simple cowboy who could fix a fence. I never thought you were simple, Jay, she said, a small smile touching her lips. I just needed to know you were real. She reached out and placed her hand over his. That man who stood up to his brother, who fought for his name, he's the same man who fixed my daughter's doll. And he's the man I've fallen in love with. The words hung in the air, simple, honest, and more powerful than any legal document. He turned to her, his blue eyes searching hers, and he saw the truth of it shining there. The pretense, the fear, the secrets, they all finally melted away, burned off by the simple, quiet power of her words. A few weeks later, there was another wedding at the Morales Ranch. Not a big one. There was no fancy dress, no crowd of cheering townspeople. It was just Annie, Jay, and Luna, standing in a small clearing by the creek where Annie's parents had been married decades before. The local preacher, a kind man with gentle eyes, read the vows. Jay didn't give her a diamond ring. Instead, he gave her a small leather-bound book. Inside the cover, in his elegant script, he had written, "To Annie, for all the chapters yet to come." It was her mother's favorite book of poetry, a copy she thought had been lost years ago. How did you? She whispered, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering. I listened, he said simply. When you talked about her, you mentioned it. It took some time to track one down. That evening, as husband and wife in truth, they sat on the porch watching Luna chase fireflies in the twilight. The air was cool and clean. The debt was paid, Jay's name was cleared, and the future stretched out before them, a blank page waiting to be written. From the road, a new sound approached. A fine-looking carriage, pulled by two magnificent black horses, rolled to a stop at their gate. A man in a driver's uniform got out and opened the door. Out stepped the severe-looking older man from the photograph, Jay's father. He walked up the path, his eyes taking in the humble ranch, the setting sun, and the woman standing beside his son. He stopped in front of them, his face unreadable. I received a letter from your investigator, he said, his voice gravelly, and another from your brother, confessing everything. William has been sent away to manage a remote holding in the north. He will not be troubling you again. Jay just nodded, his hand tightening around Annie's. The old man looked at Annie, really looked at her, for a long time. I came here to bring my son home, he said. He then looked around the ranch again, a flicker of something, understanding perhaps, in his stern eyes. But I can see he already is. He reached into his coat and produced a thick envelope. This is the inheritance William forfeited. It is yours. You have proven yourself to be more of a McCall than he ever was. Jay didn't reach for it. He just looked at his father. We don't need it. We have everything we need right here. His father nodded slowly. I know. He placed the envelope on the porch railing. Then use it to build. This land, it has good bones. Make it something that lasts. He turned without another word, got back in his carriage, and disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust. Jay and Annie stood there side by side. They looked at the envelope, then at each other. They didn't see money. They saw a future. They saw seeds for the spring, a new roof for the barn, a college education for Luna. They saw a chance to build not a silver empire, but a legacy of their own, forged not from a mine, but from the tough, unyielding, and beautiful soil of home. A new sign was nailed to the gatepost the next week. In bold, clear letters, it read, McCall Morales Ranch. They had stopped pretending. They had started building. And for the first time under the vast open sky of the New Mexico territory, they were both truly free. If that story of love, honor, and redemption struck a chord deep in your soul, then you understand that the greatest treasures aren't dug from the ground, but are grown in the heart. Jay and Annie fought for their home, but what they truly won was each other, a love more precious than silver and stronger than any lie. These are the stories we tell. Stories of the frontier, where courage is currency and love is the law of the land. If you want more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat and stir your spirit, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because the Wild West is full of legends and we're just getting started. Don't forget to leave a comment below and tell us which part of Jay and Annie's story you love the most.